It's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, so that you can have peace of mind, real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making fast, even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. In last week's blog, I've talked about 5 reasons why you need to trust yourself when your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. You can check out last week's blog by clicking on the link below this video. In this week's blog, I want to talk to you about the 5 reasons why you need to question perceived authority and expert status in intensive care. Before I get into today's topic, I want to share a quote with you that I wrote on today's topic, and the quote says, "The average family's experience when they're having a loved one critically ill in intensive care is often one of frustration, scarcity, stress, overwhelm, fear, frustration, missed opportunities, and consciously and unconsciously sabotaging their own success." Most families of critically ill patients in intensive care never achieve having peace of mind, control, power, and influence because they are infatuated with the intensive care team's perceived authority, their perceived power, and their quote-unquote expert status. This infatuation leads to families of critically ill patients in intensive care settling for the status quo, and they never get what they really want and what they and their critically ill loved one deserves. When you and your family don't question, and when you and your family don't stop sucking up to the intensive care team and to their perceived authority, their perceived power, and their expert status, you'll never have peace of mind, control, power, and influence. You, your family, and your critically ill loved one deserve the best, even if your loved one is inevitably dying in intensive care. If you consistently find that you don't get the outcomes that you want when your loved one is critically ill in intensive care, and you'll find that the intensive care team is talking over you, at you, but not with you, you must recognize that your approach is not working. You must fill in your knowledge gaps by studying those who have the kind of results you want, and then do the same things they do so that you can get the same results. So, if your loved one is critically ill in intensive care and you and your family are at a loss of what to do, you have probably realized that whatever you are doing is not working to give you the desired results, such as peace of mind, control, power, and influence. By now, you have probably consciously or unconsciously given away all your power, if you ever had any in the first place. You've given it away to the intensive care team by consciously or unconsciously sucking up to their perceived power, their perceived authority, and to their quote-unquote expert status. The fact of the matter is that if your critically ill loved one is either very unstable and in a very critical condition, or is in a life-threatening situation, or is in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, including long-term ventilation, or your loved one may be having a severe or traumatic head or brain injury, or your loved one may be threatened with an NFR, not for resuscitation, or DNR, do not resuscitate order, or your loved one may be in a situation where the intensive care team suggests a withdrawal of treatment or a limitation of treatment as being quote-unquote in the best interest of your critically ill loved one, or your loved one may even be approaching the end of life in intensive care. As a matter of fact, your approach to be content with the status quo in those situations and to never question the perceived authority, the perceived power, and the quote-unquote expert status of the intensive care team is simply doomed to fail. Fact of the matter is that if you do what 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care are doing, who have no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence, and if you never question the perceived authority, the perceived power and the expert status of the intensive care team, you'll never get the desired outcomes. The reality and the fact of the matter is that intensive care is such a complex, volatile, dynamic and highly political environment that you and your family can't see the wood for the trees, and it's easy for the intensive care team to get what they want without giving you any insights into what's really happening behind the scenes whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. It's very easy for the intensive care team to hide behind their medical jargon, behind their expert status, and behind their perceived authority and their perceived power. It's what society has told you for centuries, that you always need to listen to what the doctors have to say. And if you continue doing that, you and your family will continue to be in the 99% bracket of families of critically ill patients in intensive care who have no peace of mind, no control, no power and no influence. But there is hope, because today I want to reveal to you the 5 reasons why you need to question perceived authority and expert status in intensive care. So, get ready for this. Number 1. You need to become difficult and demanding instead of sucking up to the intensive care team's perceived power, their perceived authority and their quote-unquote expert status. Whenever I do consulting with my clients on Skype, over the phone or via email, and I lay down my strategies to help them getting peace of mind, control, power and influence quickly when they're having a loved one critically ill in intensive care, at first they always tell me that they can't do this and that they can't be difficult and demanding because they are worried that the intensive care team will not give them and their critically ill loved one favorable treatment. The fact of the matter is that with intensive care being such a complex, volatile, dynamic and highly political environment, sucking up to the intensive care team and to their perceived power, their perceived authority and their expert status will get you nowhere. The intensive care team is so used to having families sucking up to them all the time that this strategy simply won't work. The intensive care team knows that they can wrap most families in intensive care around their little finger. You need to be different. You need to do what other people don't do. And you need to implement being difficult and demanding fast. The fact of the matter is that whenever families of critically ill patients in intensive care implement becoming difficult and demanding, they also get tremendous results, and they very quickly get peace of mind, control, power and influence. The intensive care team is not used to having families in intensive care becoming difficult and demanding. Try it out at your own risk and you'll see the results very quickly. Number 2. Sucking up to and being infatuated by the intensive care team's perceived power, perceived authority and by their quote-unquote expert status will never get you what you want. Well, after more than 15 years intensive care nursing in 3 different countries, where I also spent 5 years as a nurse unit manager in intensive care, and I have dealt with and looked after thousands of critically ill patients and their families, I can assure you that 99% of those families of critically ill patients in intensive care had one thing in common. They never had any peace of mind, control, power and influence, because they consciously or unconsciously sucked up to the intensive care team and their perceived power, their perceived authority and their expert status. The sad truth is that the moving parts in intensive care, and especially the moving parts behind the scenes in intensive care, are way too powerful, so that sucking up to the intensive care team and to their perceived power, their perceived authority and to their expert status is doomed to fail. Intensive care teams have hidden agendas that go way beyond your critically ill loved one's diagnosis and prognosis, and therefore sucking up to the intensive care team will get you nowhere. Number 3. You and your family have way more peace of mind, control, power and influence than you can ever think of. If you know what to do, if you know what questions to ask, how to position yourself and how to position your critically ill loved one, and if you model what successful families of critically ill patients in intensive care do. I know you've heard me saying it before. Don't copy what 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care do, who have no peace of mind, no control, no power and no influence. Do instead what the very few of the 1% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care do, who have peace of mind, control, power and influence. Start standing out from the crowd. Stop sucking up and being infatuated by the intensive care team's perceived power, their perceived authority and their quote-unquote expert status. The intensive care team doesn't expect this, and rather than handing over your power and influence on a platter to them, dare to be different, challenge the status quo and start asking the right questions. Number 4. Know that your critically ill loved one's diagnosis, prognosis and treatment options are often presented to you as a result of what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care. The number of times families of critically ill patients in intensive care are asked to attend a formal family meeting with the intensive care team is almost identical with the number of times where the intensive care team is presenting and positioning your critically ill loved one's diagnosis, prognosis and treatment options in a negative light, and they often give families the doom and gloom speech. This positioning of your critically ill loved one's diagnosis, prognosis and treatment options leaves the intensive care team all options open, and it often leaves families in intensive care without any options. If you and your family are unprepared, and most families of critically ill patients in intensive care are unprepared, chances are that the intensive care team will walk all over you and you will feel like you have few or no perceived options. The fact of the matter is that once you know what to do, how to position yourself and your critically ill loved one's diagnosis, prognosis and treatment options, the odds of getting what you want increase dramatically, but you have to know what to do. Number 5. Especially when your critically ill loved one is not a straightforward admission into intensive care, you, your family and your critically ill loved one are doomed if you continue to suck up to the intensive care team. Most critically ill patients in intensive care are not straightforward admissions. They don't just stay one night and leave ICU alive. Most critically ill patients in intensive care are either very unstable and in a very critical condition, or they are in a life-threatening situation, or they may be in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, including long-term ventilation, or they may be having a severe or traumatic head or brain injury, or even worse, they may be threatened with an NFR, not for resuscitation, or DNR, do not resuscitate order, or they may be in a situation where the intensive care team suggests a withdrawal of treatment or a limitation of treatment as being quote-unquote in the best interest of your critically ill loved one, or your loved one may even be approaching their end of life in intensive care. During those challenging, difficult and often heartbreaking situations, your approach needs to drastically change compared to the 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care who don't get peace of mind, don't have power, don't have control and don't have influence. If you want to get peace of mind, control, power and influence quickly, you need to stand out from the crowd and you need to get to the bottom of things very quickly. You can only do that if you very quickly discover what other successful families of critically ill patients in intensive care do who have peace of mind, control, power and influence. So, how do you do that? And how can you get peace of mind, control, power and influence quickly whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? You get to that all-important feeling of peace of mind, control, power and influence when you download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free instant impact report, you learn quickly how to get peace of mind, real power and real control, and how you can influence decision making fast whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Your free instant impact report gives you in-depth insight that you must know whilst your loved one is critically ill or is even dying in intensive care. Sign up and download your free instant impact report now by entering your email below. In your free instant impact report, you learn how to speak the secret intensive care language so that the doctors and the nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In your free report, you will also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions, discover the many competing interests in intensive care and how your critically ill loved one's treatment may depend on those competing interests, how to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. You get 5 mind-blowing tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to a peace of mind, control, power and influence in your situation. You will get real-world examples that you can easily adapt to your and your critically ill loved one's situation. How to stop being intimidated by the intensive care team and how you will be seen as equals. You'll get crucial behind-the-scenes insights so that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care and how you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care, and it's not what you think. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog, and I'll see you again in another update next week. Make sure you also check out our Your Questions Answered section where I answer your questions, or send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com with your questions. Or you can call us. Find our international phone numbers on our contacts tab. Also check out our product section where you get more ebooks, videos and audio recordings, and where you can also get one-on-one consulting with me via Skype or over the phone by clicking on the products tab. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll see you again next week in another update.